Good morning. I wasn't going to say anything about this, but last week several people asked me, they saw me walking up to the pulpit, and multiple people asked me, is something wrong? Well, it's not right now, but yes, something happened prior to last week, a night or two before that, where I actually fell down about half a flight of stairs in the house. Fortunately, I managed to break my fall with my face when I got to the landing. We had a fan sitting on the landing that was about that tall off the floor. When it finished, it was that tall and laying on the floor and in pieces. So at least this week, hopefully I've been able to walk up to the pulpit a little easier than I could last week. But if you had a question, that's why I walk so gingerly getting up here. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is, Linda and I, before I've taken a number of trips, one of the trips we took was to Rome. And one of the issues you have when you take a trip to a place like Rome is that you can get so caught up in things like the Colosseum and the Vatican museums, which are incredible. I mean, the stuff that they have looted there, put there, that etc., that they have there is incredible. Our hotel was literally a stone's throw away from the doorway to the Pantheon. So it's incredible to be there. But the problem is sometimes you get so focused on these incredible things that you miss the big picture. And the big picture was, it was beautiful just to walk the streets of Rome, just to look all around you and kind of absorb it and take it in, more than any one item you found. And here we had a square we walked around where they had vendors selling things, there were shops on the side, there was food you could buy, there was all kinds of stuff like that, and it's just a totally different atmosphere. And it's very easy to miss the big picture because you're so focused on all the things you have to do and see. We've got a similar situation here in chapter 7 because Paul has been talking about singleness, he's been talking about divorce, he's been talking about remarriage, he's been talking about widows, he's on and on and on. But the real topic of the entire chapter 7, all of chapter 7, can be summarized in one phrase, and that phrase is, serve God in any situation. The point isn't all the rules about all these different states that you're in. And it's true, we go through this, we talk about this, they're important. But the main point is, I don't care if you're single, I don't care if you're married, I don't care if you're divorced, I don't care if you're widowed, you can still serve Christ no matter what state you're in. And that's the point of chapter 7, and we risk missing that because of all the details here. Now let's start with verse 18. When we get to verse 18, it says, was any man called already circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Let each man remain in the condition in which he was called. What I want to talk about here is contentment. Sometimes we are so anxious to change our situation that we forget about serving God in the situation we are in. Right here when he's talking about this, he's talking about marriage, but there's also wider implications. He's talking about if you come as a Jew, serve God as a Jew. Doesn't mean stay in Judaism, but it means it doesn't matter. You've come as a Jew, you still serve God as a believer. If you've come as a Gentile, you serve God as a believer. In our modern society, we could translate that to, I don't care what race you are, or what nationality you are, serve God as a believer once you become a believer. And that's his point he's trying to make here. Now, interestingly, he's bringing up an example from the law, but we can see in verse 20, he's tying that example back into the idea of marriage again. But the idea of what he's showing from the law is that believers are now free from the law. Remember, the law has been fulfilled by Christ. It was never set aside. It was never abolished. But it was fulfilled, and by being fulfilled, we are no longer under the law. The Mosaic law is not in effect in our lives. Now, one of the things I think that I have to admit, when I read verse 18, I almost cracked up laughing, and I've done this before when I've read 18. I think Paul deliberately picked something not only humorous, but something completely absurd as his point to show how ridiculous it was what people were trying to do in order to get into God's grace. And if you look, it says, what any man called already circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. I started thinking about that and just cracking up. Especially in that society with their technology, that is an impossibility. And not only, who would even think of that, of sewing things back on? It makes no sense whatsoever, but I think Paul deliberately picked that because it made no sense. To say, look at how ridiculous what you're saying is. Look at the idea of how you're trying to change things so you can get to a spot where you can serve God. I mean, the Corinthians at that point in time were saying things like, should I divorce my spouse so I can serve God? They were saying things like, should I divorce an unbeliever because now I've become a believer? We have on and on these misunderstandings of the Corinthians, and I think Paul's throwing it right back in their face saying, guys, this is absurd. Don't even think in these ways. It also means, when we're talking about the law here, that they were free of the commands of the Judaizers. Judaizers were people who wanted to take the Mosaic law and apply it to believers. This circumcision-uncircumcision debate was all about that, where the idea is that if you became a believer, you had to be circumcised because the Jewish law required that. The reason for circumcision was it was symbolic to show you were under the covenant that was the Abrahamic covenant. Well, the fact is, we are not bound by the law. We are not bound by that covenant. The fact is, Christ has paid the price. We now have direct access to the Father that the Jews never had. They were still believers, don't get me wrong. But we have a lot of things like that, and we don't have the same legalistic system set up. One of the things I remember growing up is, again, I've told you before, I went to Riverdale Baptist School. And while the school was great in some areas, the one thing they were hung up on was creating a legalistic system for believers to live under, not the Mosaic law, but their own legalistic system. No alcohol. Now, admittedly, if you're under 18, you shouldn't, at that point, 21 now, you shouldn't have been drinking because it was illegal. But their point was, even if you were over 18, didn't matter. And not just students, if your family drank, there was a problem, things like that. And I'm not talking about drunkenness here either, I'm talking about just drinking. If you played cards, it was a sin. If you ever danced, it was a sin. I mean, you could go on and on and on about the various things that were sins then. And you know what I saw happen with that? What I saw happen was good friends who were believers that ultimately ended up rejecting all of the teachings of the Bible or all of the teachings of the school. Because this legalism was laid on top of it that had no place in the Christian life. And instead, it pushed the people away. And not only that, but I graduated in a relatively small class that was really, really good kids. We didn't have a lot of troublemakers in the class. And within about 2 years after graduating, I ended up meeting on the street a number of them. And you know what I found? A bunch of them had gotten into drugs. Several of them were addicted to alcohol. One of them had gone off the deep end the other way and became not only King James only, but had to disassociate with all Christians that weren't KJV only. I mean, I could go on, and they were really messed up. Not because they were bad kids, but because what happened is they were so bound in legalism that when that restriction was taken away from them, they completely went the other direction. Now, fortunately, most of them turned back around as they grew up a little bit more. But the point being is it didn't work because the truth is the law has been fulfilled, and that also means we don't have to create new laws to put onto Christians. Now, if we look in verse 19, we see there is a danger to what I just said and to what Paul said in here. The danger is that circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Many people think, the law is fulfilled. We're not under the law. We can do anything we want. That's not what's being said. What's being said is you are not under the legalistic system that has these specific requirements. Right and wrong still exists. God still has given commands. And it doesn't mean we are free from to do anything we want. As a matter of fact, Paul and John both fought against something called antinomianism. That is literally from the Greek word nomos. Nomos means law. And antinomianism literally means a system which is against law, where there is no law. There are churches today that preach, because we are forgiven, we can commit any sin we want to and still be in God's grace. Well, we are in His grace, don't get me wrong, but still be doing anything we want and not have any consequences, not have to worry about it. Well, God will still correct us. God still wants us to do right and wrong. I mean, people that feel they have no restrictions whatsoever because they're believers. Now, does that mean that we're going to be judged for it and end up in hell? No. If we're a believer, we're going to heaven. But our life can still be miserable if we don't follow what God wants. It's not just that, but because we are changed, because we're new creations, there should be a natural change in us. If there's not a natural change, it says, was there really a change at all? If we have to go through, what can I get away with now that I'm a believer? Maybe there's a problem in your salvation. I'm not saying there is, but you got to think about that. That shouldn't be natural. We need to live out what we already are. But if we look at these verses, we see this about the law, but verse 20 brings us back. Let each man remain in the condition in which he was called. It's showing that Paul is using this legalism system to show that it's an example of what he's talking about with marriage. Don't try to become circumcised or uncircumcised again. Stay the way you are. If you're married also, stay married. If you're single, stay single. It's up to you. And he gives exceptions, of course. But the point being is, he's trying to show you can serve God in any situation. Now we get to verse 21, and what we start to see here is Paul is saying not only to be serving God in any situation, but to be content in serving God in any situation. Ooh, that's a little more difficult. When we read verse 21, it says, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you're also able to become free, rather do that. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. Now, let me clarify something before I get into this idea of be content in your situation, okay? One thing I want to make absolutely clear is, if your situation is living in gross sin and immorality, don't be content in that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your living situation. I mean, if you're a serial killer or a pimp, please don't be content. Change it. Also, let me say this a little closer to home. If you become a Christian or you are a Christian, you may find you need to quit your job. I've had many people come to me and say, you know something? Now that I'm a believer, I'm finding my job is incompatible with my beliefs. They're lying, they're cheating people, they're stealing. And it's not easy to pull up stakes and quit your job. I personally had a situation many, many years ago where I worked part-time for somebody, and I started to realize something is wrong here. And I was offered a job full-time with him that was a salary that was astounding. Even today the numbers would be astounding. Jaw-dropping is the only word for it. And I turned it down even though I was in financial distress, because I said, something is wrong here. Now, in my case, I had that confirmed about a month later when the guy was arrested. And when the police wanted to call me as a witness for what I had seen in the audio, or the DA wanted to call me as a witness for what I had seen going on in the office. And also when I found out that the guy who was supposedly an old family friend, yeah, he was part of the family, but not the way we're thinking about. He was probably a mob enforcer that had come into the business, because it turned out the entire business was nothing but a money laundering operation. Something in me said, the Holy Spirit in me said, you can't stay here. There's something wrong. And I passed up on the money because of it. And I'm so glad I did. But maybe not as dramatic, but maybe some of you are going to face choices where you have to actually say, can I stay at my job because my job involves cheating people? It happens quite a bit. Now back to this slave or free. Let's talk about some things that are not politically correct, okay? I mean, think about this. In our society, if I said to you, well, if you're a slave, just stay a slave and be content. Boy, you couldn't say anything much more politically incorrect than that. But two things we've got to look at. Number one, what was the society then? The fact is, they did have slaves. And by the way, it was probably not racial then. It was more like people that were conquered became slaves. People that were kidnapped became slaves. Whoever they could get their hands on became slaves. But the point being is, slavery was a fact of life in that day. And what Paul was saying is, if you are a slave, you still have an obligation to serve God. It doesn't mean that you can say, my situation's terrible, therefore I don't have to serve God. Every one of us is under obligation to serve Christ. Not only that, but because we have been bought with a price by Christ, and we are now slaves to Christ, which in a strange twist gives us ultimate freedom. I know that sounds weird. If you're a regular slave, that's not giving you freedom. And Paul even says, if you have the chance to get out of it, if you're being set free, take it, because you got more opportunities to serve God that way. But if you're bound in slavery, remember, you are a slave to Christ ultimately. And it's weird, as I said, this slavery gives us freedom. One of the things I remember when I was younger, I remember being in a church in a Sunday school class, and they asked us to go around the circle, and each person tell who they would like to be if they could be anyone, who they would trade their life for. And today you'll hear things like, oh, if I were Bill Gates, I'd have billions of dollars, and I could do this, and I could do that. Or if I was, whoever, pick a billionaire out of your name, okay? Well, you know something? If you're saved and they're not, I don't care how much money they have, you are a slave to Christ, which makes you more free than any billionaire could possibly be. Whether it's a billionaire, whether it's a famous athlete, whether it's an actor or actress, whoever you want to pick to trade lives with, they're not as free as you are if you're saved and they're not. You have a freedom to serve God that they do not have. And that freedom to serve God is in any circumstances. Now, if we continue on in these verses at 23, it says, you were bought. Let me get these apart. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each man remain with God in the condition in which he was called. Right off the bat, he's talking about we're slaves to Christ. Don't become a slave to men. Wonder what he was talking about there. Kind of a strange phrase, isn't it? Because he's talking about a person who is liberated. And I think what he's talking about there is enslaving ourselves through circumstances. And we do that ourselves too. How many people in here, and I've done it myself, have ever been a slave because of money? You really can't change jobs, you really can't move, you really can't do this, you really can't do that. Doesn't matter what God calls you to, you're kind of stuck. Some people are slaves to alcohol or drugs. They can't serve God because they've got to get that next fix or they've got to get that next drink. Other people, slaves to power. Look at politicians. Most politicians, unfortunately, to make it up the ladder, have to sell their souls. Most of them are not talking about what they believe anymore. They're talking about what will get them votes. Look at Congress. What are they talking about? Who can I give something to get them to vote for me? They're not looking about for what's best for the country or what their principles are. Almost all of them are sellouts. Every one of these situations makes us slaves. And you may not be a politician, but each one of us spends money. Do you put yourselves through overspending into situations where you can't get out of or where you cannot serve God? And again, I'm not taking myself out of this also because I've done this at times. As a matter of fact, I personally believe that overspending may be the one biggest thing that puts Christians into bondage when even though we're slaves to Christ, we're in bondage to the Lord and in bondage to other people. Try going a couple of months without making a mortgage payment and see if you're not in some kind of a bondage with the mortgage company. They're going to pay you a visit. Now let's go on in these verses. In verse 25 through 25, we see it says, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as to one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. A couple of things we need to see here. Number one, when Paul is using the word virgins, it can actually, in this context, it can actually have multiple meanings. First thing we think of with virgin is, has not had sex. Almost certainly we can see in the other verses they come up, when he's using the word virgin, he's actually talking about, in that day it would have been a person who was betrothed. Essentially a fiancé is our closest thing we have to it today. So what he's talking about is people who have not consummated the marriage, but who are already engaged to be married. Okay? The second thing we have to see is from verse 25 right through verse 40, Paul is giving personal opinion. Inspired, yes, the entire Bible is inspired by God. But Paul's not saying this is an absolute command you have to follow. Instead, what he's saying is, here are some things I think you ought to know for practical reasons, and they're going to help your life out and make it easier for you to serve God. But it's not absolute commands from 25 through 40, and we're going to see that. Now in 25, as I said, he said, not a command from the Lord, but he continues on and says, I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Number one, it's not a command, but number two, you see that word in this present distress. What's he talking about? We don't know exactly why, but there must have been some kind of persecution going on. And what he's saying is, in these circumstances, I think it's better for you not to get married. Let's face it, if you are in distress, if you're being persecuted, if you have people coming after you, it's easier to look out for things if you're alone usually than if you're married, and especially if you got kids. I mean, you think back to some place like Nazi Germany or something. It was much easier for a single person to try to flee them than it was for a guy to gather up his entire family and find a way to get out. Not that it didn't happen, but a practical sense, it's much easier that way. Now, one of the things we have is a misconstruing of this verse, and this verse is one of the verses that's used by the Roman Catholics to say, see, if you're going to be a priest, you have to be celibate and you have to stay unmarried. That's not what that verse is saying at all. As a matter of fact, it's not even a command. And not only that, I have a question for you. If church leaders are supposed to remain unmarried, then why did Paul say that elders are supposed to be the husband of one wife? It doesn't make any sense. But that's just misusing that verse. Now, if we continue on, and we are covering these verses a little fast this week, and it's more verses than normal, but I thought it was appropriate to group them together because they go over a lot of things we've already hit in the first part of the chapter as well. If we go to verse 27, it says, "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you should marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin should marry, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you." Again, we can see the practical advice. The other thing he's saying is, serve God wherever you are, but then he's going to the other side and saying, but look, if you need to marry, get married. It's okay. You're not sinning. One of the things that I will never forget is being asked by someone, should I divorce my wife so that I can become a pastor because I need to have more time? I think you can guess what my answer was. And the truth is that people actually think that way. And what Paul is saying here, if you've got a wife, don't divorce her. Stay with her, live with her, and serve God whatever situation you're in. Again, it's all coming back to serving God in any situation. The truth is, you may have more time if you don't have a wife, but God never said, get rid of that wife. God ordained the family, God created the family, and God never says, break up your family so that you can serve God. One of the things we've talked about here in the past, I've been at other churches, the same thing. We've talked about the fact, I think we've agreed on this. I certainly know it's my strong opinion. I do not believe that our church should support a missionary if they take their children and send them off to missionary school and don't stay with the family. If they take them to the field with them, that's fine. If they take a furlough and come back and educate them here, that's fine. But I've met too many missionary kids that were completely destroyed because their parents would send them away 9 months a year or whatever. Yeah, you go live in some other part of the world and get educated while we do God's work. Everyone that I've ever known that was in that situation came away saying, they sacrificed me for God, and why should I like God? And they hated God in most cases. I think God ordained the family, I know He did, ordained the family unit. He created it, and there's no reason to destroy it to try to honor God. And that's what Paul's saying here. If you're married, fine. If you're not, fine. But practical advice, you probably may not want to get married right now because of this present trouble if you're not married already. But if you have to marry, you're not sinning. It's better than being immoral. So that's the advice coming from Paul again. And we continue on to verse 29, and 29 through 31 says, "But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as those who did not rejoice, and those who buy as those who did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away." Now, when you start reading this and you see things like, if you have a wife, act like you don't have a wife, things like that, you're like, has Paul lost his mind? What's he talking about? Something's wrong here. This doesn't make any sense. These are odd verses on the surface, okay? What we're seeing, however, is that they're actually not odd verses. They're trying to make a point. And the point when he says, if you're married, don't act like you're married, isn't to say, don't have your normal marriage, okay? But what he's saying is, you still have to have your priorities straight in serving God. When he's saying, buy as if you don't buy, or buy as if you don't own, don't be stuck and rooted in the world. The world wants you to say, here are my possessions, here's what I have. He's not saying ignore your wife. It's just not what he's saying. He's trying to make the point of this world is not the point, it's not the main thing. And the reason? Because the time is shortened and the world is passing away. Ultimately, this world is not our home, and ultimately this world is not going to continue eternally. So again, it's something where he's saying, hey, remember to serve God in any situation. And I keep repeating that for a reason. Because we keep having the message come through over and over and over in this chapter. That's the message that's coming through, is serving God no matter what your situation. Now, something else that I should point out here is that Paul may have prophetically been talking about something coming up, and I'm not sure about this, but Paul may have been prophetically talking about something that we know happened in history. This book was written sometime between 53 and 57 AD. We're not exactly sure when, but somewhere in that area, the mid-50s, okay? In 60 AD, Nero went nuts. I've mentioned before, from 54 AD to 60 AD, Nero was the best emperor Rome had ever had. 60 AD is like somebody switched a light switch, and suddenly persecution of Christians was rampant. I mentioned before how he would take living Christians, tie them to poles, and put tar on them and light them on fire in order to light up his garden parties. And if you didn't come to the party, you might face the same fate. Paul was almost certainly killed under Nero. Paul may well have known prophetically from God, hey, this is coming, and if this is coming, you better be ready to flee if the need be. That may have been his reason. I'm not saying it was, but something was happening here. And because of that, when you look at these three verses put together, the summary of it is, don't plant your roots in the world. If your roots are in the world, you're going to be in trouble. If you're stuck here because I bought this house, you're going to be in trouble. And let's face it, home mortgages hold people in place. And is he saying rent instead of own? At that particular point in time, yes, he was. As far as the weeping, rejoicing, possessing, all these things he said, what it's really coming down to is the world is not more important than God. It's as simple as that. Put God first, then the other things will fall into place. But if you're tied into this idea that you've got to have money, possessions, anything that comes ahead of God, you're going to have a problem. And it's going to create problems. Now we also see something else in these verses we just covered, all of them, is that all of this advice applies specifically to the Corinthian church. Does it apply today? Not necessarily. Let's face it. Do we suffer persecution as believers in the U.S.? Yeah, to some degree we do. There are people that are taken to court that have various things. There are people that are even attacked for their beliefs. But when you compare it to what's happening around the world and compare it to history, it's nothing. If you lived in Saudi Arabia, or you lived in Iran, or you lived in Indonesia, or you lived in, I could go on and on with various countries, and you had an American Christian talking about the way they're being persecuted, they'd probably laugh in your face, and we would deserve it. Not because we don't have some persecution, don't get me wrong, but in those countries, they know what persecution is. And if you're a believer in those countries, and I would say this, if you're a single man, or even a single woman, if you're a single person in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, and you're a believer, and again, those are all, I could have named on and on and on, Pakistan, etc. If you're in one of those countries and you're single, and you're a believer rather, I would recommend two things. Don't buy a house, don't get tied down by money, and probably don't get married so you can move fast if you have to. That advice from Paul would still apply. Doesn't mean it would be wrong to do any of those things. But the advice would still be practical advice in many countries in the world today. In our country? No. In our country, I'd probably say buy a house because it's a good investment and get married and enjoy life. Obviously while serving God. Because the context doesn't fit us. This context was for a very specific situation going on at a specific point in time, and we have to be careful lifting that out and applying it to everybody, especially when Paul says, this isn't a command, but I'm giving you practical advice. So that's why we have to, and I'm not ignoring the Bible at all. I'm saying apply the Bible in context, and remember, there's only a couple of spots in the entire Bible where Paul has actually said, hey, I'm giving you opinion instead of a command. But this is one of those spots. Not only that, but it's funny, I remember back being not old enough to ever be face the draft, but old enough to get to the point where I was going to have to sign up for it within a couple of years, and thinking to myself, wow, I don't really want to go fight in a war. And I did have to sign up with selective service, but I didn't actually go through a draft. But I remember, if you're old enough, you'll remember that. You remember, if I say ping pong balls to an older person, that has a whole different meaning than it does to a younger person. Because when I say ping pong balls, I see you nodding your head. Yeah. When I say ping pong balls literally meant, were you going to be taken from your home, drafted, and sent to war, or were you going to get to stay at home? They had a ping pong ball machine, and it would pop dates out. And it's birthday. If your birthday came up, you're gone. That's the order you're going to be taken in. It'd be televised a lot of time. And frankly, I got to figure for the people that were actually of draft age, that had to be terrifying to watch those ping pong balls. Again, I mean, hey, I see a ping pong table, I want to play ping pong. Some people, they could be in real distress seeing a ping pong ball, and that's why. The reason I bring that up is because one of the big questions you would always hear back then is people that would say, should I get married before I go overseas or before I go into the army or not? People who had already fallen in love and maybe were engaged. And there was no right or wrong answer, but in many cases it was no, because if I get killed, I don't want the wife or the husband, the wife normally to go through that. And it was really their choice. But it was kind of a similar situation in circumstances to what they were facing here is, should I get married in Corinth or not? It was all practical. It wasn't because it was a right and a wrong. It was a practical situation. Now, if we start looking at verse 32, what we're seeing is this next set of verses are going to talk about our freedom to follow God. In verse 32 it says, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. The first question you got to say is, why does he say free from concern? The reason is because there is a legitimate freedom to being able to freely serve God if you're a believer. And when he's saying the unmarried can serve God, all he's really saying is because he's got more time. He's not saying it's wrong to be married. He's just saying if that's your state and you can maintain it and not be immoral in that state, then please do it and serve God. And when it says the married man must please his wife, if any of you are married, and many of you are, as I am as well, there's nothing wrong with saying that. It's just a practical fact of you have an obligation to please your wife. You have an obligation to be a good husband. It's not that it's wrong to do the other, to marry or not be married. It's just Paul stating facts about obligations. And again, remember, if they did marry at that point in time, God ordained the family. He wasn't upset. There was no sin in marrying. He then goes on in verse 34 and he says, and his interests are divided, and the woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Here Paul turns to the other side of it. And also here where he's saying the unmarried woman and the virgin, I think this again is getting into where he's using that word. We're translating as virgin what really should probably be translated as fiancé in our language and our modern culture. That's what the most close equivalent to it, okay? But the point is, what he's saying is, if you are an unmarried woman, you have more freedom to serve God. Now again, this has been taken to extremes. That's how nuns came about in the Roman Catholic Church. There's nothing about that in the Bible. There's nothing to support it either. But that's how they've taken it. But you do have more time to serve God if you're not married. In verse 35 it says, and this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote that what is seemly, and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Again, this is not a command from God. This is simply practical advice to say, if you're unmarried, it's easier to serve God in many cases. Now, one of the things I look at and I've seen over time is I've had cases where I have employees that are single or were single and are now married, and they're still great employees, don't get me wrong. And I've had married employees, single employees, back and forth. And the one thing I've seen is when you have a guy who loves to do computer work and loves to investigate the mysteries of why the network went wrong and everything, and he's single, oh, he's a great employee, normally. The exception is if he's staying out till 4 a.m. drinking or trying to, now I haven't had this happen, but if he's staying out late at night and he's not getting sleep because he's so frustrated about finding a woman or something, that's different. But the guys that I've had who were single, they're like, hey, I got nothing else to do. Sure, I'll spend 17 hours straight working on this thing and fixing it. It was great. When they got married, they're still great employees, but their priorities changed. And that's understandable. And because of that, instead of getting upset about that, I gave them wedding gifts. Great, you're still going to be a great employee, but your priorities changed. And I've even said, one guy in particular I've said to at times, you know something? Take it easy. Take a break this day. Take a break this day. You know, go have dinner with your wife or something. And sometimes I'll even pay for it just to say, look, it's fine to be married and you're still a great employee. I also know that children become a factor. Linda and I didn't have children. That's just the way it was. As such, it gives me more freedom to do things that I could not do if I had children. Would it have been nice to have children? Yeah. But that wasn't what happened, so therefore we have more time to serve the Lord. All of this contributes to time factors of serving the Lord. Now I want to say something in verse 36 also. I need to read it to you. Verse 36 says, but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter, if he should be of full age, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. That is from the New American Standard Version, and even though I like the NASB, that is probably one of the worst translations I've heard in the history of the translating of the Bible. Okay? The way the NASB translate that verse, it really makes it sound like if you're a pedophile and you like your daughter and she's hot, go for it, no problems. That is absolutely not what that verse is saying, and it's not even close to the subject of that verse, but it is a horrendous translation if you have the NASB. And the NASB is the only version that does this. As a matter of fact, the ESV translates this as, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, having no necessity but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. That has nothing to do with marrying your unwed daughter, especially if she's a juvenile. And the NASB's translation here, the reason they did this is because, remember I said you had to look at that word virgin and realize it actually means fiance? Well, they took it to mean daughter, which, yeah, it's possible, but it's really outside translation. And when you do that, you end up with some translations that just end up horrifyingly bad. As I said, I don't think I've ever seen a worse translation in any version of the Bible than this particular verse in the NASB. Because it obviously not only doesn't mean that, it's not even the subject of it. But if we start looking at what it's really saying is, what it's really talking about is the fact that if you are engaged, and instead of getting married, you're able to control your desires and act morally, then it would be better to not marry in these present circumstances. That fits the context, that fits the language, that makes sense. If you read the NASB, it does not mean what it looks like it says. Again, it comes back to serve God in any circumstances. If we go to verses 37 through 40, it says, but he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his will and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. Now again, that's the NASB translation. That word daughter is just wrong. It's not there. They did the same thing again. But then both he who gives his own virgin daughter, and again, that word has been added. It's not in the text at all. In marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. What's coming out here is simple. It's not a sin to marry. There's nothing wrong with marry. It was only practical advice Paul was giving. Marriage is an obligation. Some people function better when married. I function better when married than I did when I was single. Some people function better when they're single. Either way, we can serve God. And verses 39 and 40, a wife is bound as long as her husband lived, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I also have the Spirit of God. Very simple here. If you're a believer and your spouse dies, you're free to remarry. Now that may sound like a very simple thing to say, but honestly, I've known a number of people that felt like somehow they would be betraying their past spouse if they remarried. You may feel that way. You may feel guilt, and if you decide not to marry for that reason, that's fine, but God doesn't feel that way. There's no sin whatsoever in remarrying a believer if your spouse died. It's that simple. And that's what Paul's trying to say here. Now, I will say this. If you can remain a widow or a widower, I've seen cases, my grandfather was a good case, where suddenly when my grandmother died, he spent 15 more years serving the church, serving his family, becoming a confidant of every pastor his church ever had, leading the church, and right up into his 80s when he died, serving Christ in ways that it's not that it was wrong beforehand. He was still serving God completely before his wife died. But you saw a whole new phase of his life begin, because then he was a single person serving God. And Paul was saying, hey, if you can do that, that works out even better. Now we do have, even though we're running a little longer here now, we do have a couple of applications I want to go over real quick. Number one, serving God wherever you are. We've repeated that over and over. That means any state that you're in. Your marital status doesn't matter. Serve God anyway. But two things I want to say. Number one, this doesn't apply just to married, because sometimes we think it's only talking about marriages here. It also means serving God in whatever you're in, employment-wise, friend-wise, etc. And it also means now, not later. When Linda and I got married, we actually decided and made a priority to do traveling to see the world, so that and fortunately we found a way to do it for almost free through points. But the point is, we made it a priority because how many people have you known? I can't tell you how many people you've known. When I retire, we're going to go see the world, and you know what happens? A lot of times they're so broken down when they retire, they never get to see anything. I think seeing the rest of the world has exposed us to a lot of things we never would have been exposed to otherwise, and actually given us a more complete view of ourselves, of our world, of our country, and of God. So I think it's been beneficial. But the point is that we made it a priority to start doing it immediately, even when we didn't always have the money for it right after we got married. Well, you know something? The same exact thing applies to serving Christ. How many people do you know that are going to serve Christ once they get retired? They're really going to be on fire once they've got the time to do it. Well, you know something? You're never going to have the time to do it. Ain't going to happen that way. We never get to a point where we have just so much time laying around that it's just easy to have time. And if you do, there's probably something wrong with your life. But the point is, the time to serve Christ is now. Later too. But it starts immediately. It doesn't start an hour from now, a day from now, or 50 years from now. It starts this minute, saying how we're going to serve Christ. Now, the other thing I want to say that's kind of a misnomer, sometimes we think of serving Christ only in how many people have you witnessed to today. Witnessing is great. Witnessing is important. But remember, the Great Commission talks about making disciples by means of teaching and baptizing. There are things, the Christian life is more than just witnessing. We witnessing because it should bubble out of us. Because we should be telling people because of how happy we are with Christ. But if we're not growing in Christ, studying the Bible, learning the Scriptures, and developing as believers and being discipled, we don't have a story to tell. We may be saved, but that's it. Whereas instead, the story we can tell if we truly become disciples of Christ is so much greater and so much better. Almost knocked that over, but I grabbed it at the last minute. I was impressed with that. Anyway, the point being is, it starts now, and it's more than just witnessing. It's something else. Do you have a job? I bet there's somebody at your job who's not a believer. And if they are all believers, great, you can talk to them and disciple each other. Do you have friends? I bet you could find a friend to witness to or disciple or whatever. Even if you're in jail. Let's say you're in jail for a long sentence. You know something? You can be a believer in jail and have a jail ministry from within the jail. There is no situation where you can't be ministering for God and serving for God right now. Nobody is exempt from that, period. No believer is exempt from that. And if you're not doing that, you're not living out what you already are if you're a believer. When people meet you, do you talk about God? And I don't mean forcing it. I mean, you got the type where, I meet people and first thing they say to you is, do you know Jesus is your Lord and Savior? And you're going to hell if you don't. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about it just bubbles out. I'm talking about when you go home among believers, do you talk in your home about God? We do all the time. And you know something? It's not an act and it's not put on. It just bubbles out. It doesn't have to be something we force or something like that. But think about it. Think about it in your life. Are you talking to fellow believers about God? Maybe a good measure of how our spiritual life is developing. Are you studying the Bible? And I'm not talking about just devotions. I'm talking studying the Bible. Are you growing in Christ? Let me ask you a question that's a tough one, and I heard it mentioned earlier by two other elders. Not knocking you guys, but just got to say this. Is your passion for Jesus Christ as great as your passion for the Washington Redskins or the Dallas Cowboys? I mean, let's face it. We get down there, I've seen it before, you get 5 guys in a room watching a TV, watching a football game, and they're jumping all over the furniture, screaming, throwing their arms up and everything else. That flag shouldn't have gone out. That was wrong. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying that. But why aren't we all that way for Jesus Christ? It should be a lot easier to get excited for Jesus Christ than it is for the Redskins or the Cowboys. And I'm not even knocking them. I'm just saying, where is our passion? Do you have a passion to let Christ bubble out from you? If you don't, change it. There's something wrong. Serving God in all circumstances. That's what he's talking about. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is purity and temptation. Paul's been talking about marriage throughout this thing and singleness. If you burn, marry. It's fine. He's not saying don't marry. The most important thing is to serve in whatever circumstances you're in. Not try to fit yourself into circumstances that aren't you. All of this chapter is coming down to one thing. And all it's coming down to is serving God in any situation. And when we put it on a personal level, what it's really coming down to is one thing. Are you personally ready to serve God in any circumstances you're in? Each one of us, me as well. If the answer is no, or if it's not a wholehearted yes, almost a yes with a cheer at the end of it, maybe there's something wrong and maybe we need to change our lives. Let's go ahead and pray.